He walked into the diner like someone carrying a secret that didn't fit in a place that small, and the moment he pushed the door open, the quiet talk inside floated around him without even noticing who he really was. That was the strange part, because anyone else would have looked twice at a man like him. Yet here he blended into the booths and old photos on the wall like he had always belonged there. And that is where the moment began, the one hinted in the title, the moment when a billionaire ordered the cheapest meal and set off a chain of changes he could never have seen coming. The waitress named Grace placed the menu in front of him with a warm smile, and although she had no idea who he was, her kindness landed with a weight he couldn't explain. He felt a strange tug inside, something uncomfortable, as if her gentleness showed the contrast between her world and the one he came from. She didn't rush him, didn't treat him with suspicion, didn't act impressed. She treated him like any other man passing through town, and that normal moment hit him harder than expected. The plate she brought was simple, and her voice was soft, and somehow those tiny details made him feel strangely exposed. A man like him wasn't supposed to sit quietly in a diner like this. A man like him wasn't supposed to feel anything about a meal that cost less than the pen he carried in his pocket. And yet the feeling grew, and he found himself wondering how a woman like her could smile so easily in a place so worn down. Something deeper was hidden here, not just in her eyes, but in the room itself, and he felt it before he even understood why he had come. He listened without meaning to as Grace moved from table to table, greeting people she clearly knew by name, checking on them as if they were family. Her voice carried across the diner in gentle pieces, and through those pieces, he learned more about the town than any report his company had prepared for him. He heard bits about late shifts, long winters, a school fundraiser running short, and the factory that kept the town alive even on its worst days. He had spent years looking at that factory through charts and projections, marking its decline as a simple line growing thinner on a screen. But hearing people talk about it with tired hope made each number feel like a bruise. Something in him tightened because he knew more than they did. While they tried to stay positive, while they reminded each other that good years always came back around, he already carried the decision that could change everything for them. The life he lived never required him to face the people behind the numbers, and his normal world was built on distance, on staying far enough away that the impact of his choices never touched him. For years that distance made things simple, but now, in this tiny diner, the distance shrank. He felt a pull he didn't want to feel, a kind of guilt fighting with habits shaped by years of cold business logic. And as Grace poured coffee for an older man and told him not to lose hope, Elias wondered how long he could keep pretending that the factory was just another branch on a list, not the heart of the town surrounding him. The shift happened when Grace paused near the counter and spoke quietly to another customer about her husband. She didn't complain, didn't sound angry, didn't beg for sympathy. She simply said he was worried about layoffs and that they were trying to stay steady, reminding herself and the listener that people in this town were tougher than numbers on a screen. Those words landed sharp inside Elias, sharper than any accusation could. They revealed something simple and painful. She believed in strength because she had no choice. She believed in the town because the town was all they had. And without knowing it, she was speaking directly to the man whose decisions were causing that fear. He felt the truth press against him, heavy and unavoidable. In that moment, he saw the gap between wealth and struggle, between power and consequence, and for the first time, he felt ashamed of the silence he hid behind. Her dignity pushed against everything he thought he understood. He wondered if he should speak, if he should admit who he was, if he should say anything at all. But the words stayed trapped in his throat because he feared how her face would change once she realized he wasn't a stranger passing through, but the one who had the final say on the future of her home. His mind spun, caught between cowardice and awakening, and that tension pulled him deeper than he meant to go. Something inside him cracked, and he knew nothing about this meal would stay simple anymore. His phone buzzed again and again, almost shaking across the table as messages from Victor Hale rolled in with cold precision. Each message pushed for the same conclusion: close the factory now, approve the shutdown, stop delaying decisions that should have been made already. The tone was firm, strategic, free of empathy. He stared at the screen, feeling trapped between two worlds. One world was the empire he built, a place where numbers ruled and emotions meant weakness. The other world was right here, in this diner, carried in Grace's tired smile and the people who trusted their routines to survive another day. She came by and poured more coffee without noticing the turmoil building inside him, and that simple act made his chest tighten. She showed him a kind of human warmth he hadn't felt in years, and that warmth stirred up guilt he didn't know how to handle. The pressure grew like a knot, twisting tighter with every message, and he knew he couldn't sit there forever pretending he didn't hear the storm on both sides. Something inside him whispered that the way he lived was no longer sustainable. His decisions were shadows stretching over people who had no say in the matter. The tension built, pulling him toward a choice he wasn't ready to face. He felt the moment inch closer, the kind of moment that splits a life into before and after, and he knew something was about to break. When he finally stood, he expected to walk out, drive away, and return to the comfortable distance that had always kept his conscience quiet. He placed cash under the plate, ready to escape the uncomfortable truths the diner had stirred, but his feet refused to move toward the exit. Instead, a different impulse rose inside him, deeper and heavier than anything the board could demand. He turned, stepped outside, and instead of taking the road back to the insulated world he knew, he headed toward the factory he had planned to close. The decision wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, almost fragile, but it carried the weight of something irreversible. By choosing to see the factory with his own eyes, to walk into the place where Grace's husband and so many others worked, he crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The spreadsheets and projections no longer felt like enough to justify the pain behind them. His world had shifted, and even though he felt a flicker of fear at what he might find, he also felt a strange sense of direction. Something in him was changing, and he sensed that whatever waited for him inside that building would shape the next part of his life with a force he could no longer ignore. And that thought pulled him forward, toward the truth he had avoided for far too long. Before we dive in, pause the video for a second and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This part of the story hits hard for a lot of people, and it always feels powerful to see how many folks out there understand what it means when a job holds a whole family together. Drop your city or state, then hit play, so we can keep going. Elias had barely left the diner when the weight in his chest pushed him toward the factory instead of the highway. Now he stood inside the building that had lived as nothing more than a line item in his spreadsheets, and the hum of machines felt louder than he remembered. The air carried a mix of metal, oil, and human fatigue, and as he walked through the aisles unnoticed, he caught sight of men and women who moved with the slow, practiced rhythm of people who had given years to a place that rarely gave anything back. The faces he passed showed pride edged with worry, the kind of worry he had heard in Grace's voice, but hadn't truly understood until he saw how deeply it lived in the room. A woman tightened bolts with steady hands, a man checked gauges with the focus of someone who couldn't afford mistakes, and every step reminded him that the shutdown he'd been planning would hit harder than he'd ever let himself admit. He stopped near a workstation, where an older worker wiped his forehead and leaned against a railing for a moment of rest. The man looked like someone who had carried his share of storms, yet still kept showing up because showing up was the only option. When Elias asked how long he'd been there, the worker answered with a tired grin, saying he started back when the place was booming, when jobs felt solid and futures felt brighter, when the factory sponsored local ball teams and summer picnics. He spoke with soft pride, but that pride cracked a little when he mentioned how folks were scared now. Then he said something that made Elias freeze. There was a man named Tom Miller who was barely holding on after some setbacks, and if layoffs came, that family might lose everything. Hearing Grace's last name pulled a string inside Elias he wasn't ready for. He had come here to face the numbers, but now the numbers had a name, a life, a marriage, a kitchen table where fear probably sat every night. The older worker didn't know who he was talking to, didn't sense the storm forming behind Elias's eyes, didn't know that the man standing in front of him held the key to the Miller family's future. Elias felt a tightness in his throat, the guilt sharper now because it was no longer abstract. It was personal. He nodded quietly, pretending to be just another visitor doing routine checks, but inside something ground against his old way of thinking. Grace's gentle strength in the diner, and now this man's matter-of-fact worry for her husband, forced him to see that closing this place wouldn't just adjust a balance sheet, it would wipe out stories and memories and dignity. And that truth made his steps heavier as he moved deeper into the building, each sound echoing the choices he had been avoiding for too long. By the time he reached the far end of the floor, he could barely focus on the machines. His thoughts kept circling back to Grace's voice, telling that customer they would find a way. Her calm faith in a future she didn't know was hanging by a thread only he could cut. It shook him enough that he stopped again, staring at the rows of equipment that had been running for decades, and wondered how many marriages, retirements, and dreams were tied to the rhythm of these conveyor belts. He felt almost ashamed standing there, dressed in clothes that hid his position, while the people around him carried on unaware that their fate was walking right past them. Part of him wanted to leave before someone asked who he was. Another part wanted to find Tom right then and there, to look the man in the eye and feel the truth he'd been hiding from. But fear held him in place. Fear of facing what he had caused. Fear of admitting that one woman's kindness had shaken the foundation of everything he believed made him strong. Still, the name Tom Miller echoed too loudly to ignore. Grace's husband was not just another employee. He was now a symbol of all the lives tangled in the decision. Elias had been ready to sign off without hesitation. That realization pulled him toward a doorway leading to the break room, his heart beating faster than the machines behind him. If he walked through, he might find Tom. If he didn't, he would stay trapped in the old version of himself, the one he was beginning to shed. For the first time in years, the choice in front of him felt like more than business. It felt like the start of something that could change the course of it all, and that thought stopped him in the doorway, unsure of whether to step forward or turn back. Elias walked farther into the factory until he saw a man sweeping metal dust from beneath a long workbench, moving with the kind of quiet focus that comes from years of carrying weight without complaint. He recognized the name stitched on the shirt pocket even before he spoke, and something inside him tightened as he realized he had found Tom without even planning it. Tom didn't look up right away, just kept working, humming a little tune that almost sounded like someone trying to keep spirits steady. When Elias finally asked how things were going, Tom gave a small laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all, and said he was doing whatever he could to stay ahead because he had people depending on him. He talked about long nights, about taking extra shifts when they were offered, about trying to keep worry away from his wife because she already carried too much. The honesty in his voice made it impossible for Elias to pretend he was just a visitor. Watching this man push through fear with so much quiet strength left Elias feeling exposed, and for a moment he had to look away to hide what was shifting in his chest. Tom asked if Elias worked for the company, and the pause that followed felt heavy enough to bend the air. Elias answered in a soft, vague way, not fully lying but not fully telling the truth either. Tom didn't press him. Instead, he said something that hit even harder, that sometimes the only thing a person could do was keep showing up in hope that someone somewhere still cared enough to make the right call. Those words weren't meant for him specifically, but they landed as if Tom had spoken straight into the choices Elias had been avoiding. The sincerity in the man's eyes made Elias want to apologize then and there, but the words refused to come out, caught between pride and shame. He found himself thanking Tom for talking with him, using a tone that felt almost unfamiliar, softer than he usually allowed. Tom nodded like he understood without needing an explanation, and that small gesture of respect created a warmth in Elias that he hadn't felt since the days before money became armor. Moments like this always seem to hit different for everyone listening, because almost every person has known someone like Tom, or been someone like Tom, carrying responsibility with no room to fall. If anyone out there feels that, it's worth sharing because stories like this connect strangers in ways we don't always expect, making the room feel a little smaller and a little kinder for all of us together. Elias stepped out of the break room with a weight that followed him all the way back to his car. The factory noise faded behind him, replaced by the buzzing phone in his hand. A video call from the board lit up his screen, and he already knew Victor would be leading it. When he answered, Victor's face appeared with that sharp look he always wore during numbers-driven battles. Victor wasted no time, going straight into charts and losses and projected declines, insisting that the factory was dragging the company down. He talked about closures like they were housekeeping tasks, something clean and simple. Listening to him after talking with Tom felt like standing between two worlds pulling in opposite directions. Every argument Victor made felt colder now, and every time Victor said the word liability, Elias saw Grace's face and heard Tom's tired hope. Elias tried pushing back gently, suggesting delays, but Victor cut him short, saying leadership meant making tough decisions, not emotional ones. The board chimed in with the same tone, pushing urgency, pushing closure, pushing obedience. The call ended with Victor announcing that they wanted an immediate vote. No more waiting, no more tours, no more excuses. They expected Elias to approve the shutdown so they could move forward without disruption. For a long moment he simply stared at the blank screen, his reflection faint in the dark glass, looking like a man caught between who he had been and who he might become. Inside him, the conflict grew louder, pressing against old habits and old armor. The weight of Grace's voice, the strength in Tom's eyes, the exhaustion on the factory floor, all of it rose until he felt completely torn. He knew a choice was coming, and it would define more than the company. It would define him. And as he sat there in the driver's seat, hands still on the wheel, he felt the next moment building, something that could push everything toward a point he couldn't back away from. Elias drove back to town with Tom's voice still echoing in his head, every word settling deeper than he expected. By the time he pulled into the diner's parking lot, the sky had shifted into the soft color of late afternoon, and something in that quiet light made him hope he could find a clearer answer inside. When he stepped through the door, Grace was wiping down a table and humming the same gentle tune she had hummed before. She looked up, gave him that same warm smile she gave every stranger, and welcomed him without the faintest sign of recognition. That alone softened something inside him. He sat in the same booth as earlier, trying to make sense of the storm inside his chest. Grace walked over with a pot of coffee, and when she poured it, she glanced at him with a quiet curiosity, noticing the tired look on his face. She didn't ask the kind of questions that pry. Instead, she simply said that some days weigh heavier than others, and the best thing a person can do is breathe through them until things make sense again. The way she said it felt more like understanding than advice, and Elias felt the truth of it settle under his ribs. She checked on him again a few minutes later, and somehow the conversation slipped into a place he didn't plan. He asked how she stayed so steady when things seemed uncertain around her, and she shrugged with the kind of calm that only comes from living through enough storms to stop fearing the next one. She said people get through things by remembering who they are, not by running from what scares them. She said her husband always told her that a person should never let fear make their decisions for them, or it becomes the thing that owns their life. Hearing that hit Elias harder than he expected. He had spent years letting fear of loss and pressure guide him, hiding behind numbers because they felt safer than people. Grace didn't know it, but her words touched the weak spot he tried to ignore, the one that ached more with every step he took inside the factory. He thanked her quietly, and she smiled in a way that made him feel like she could see straight through the surface without needing any details. Her sincerity showed him something he lacked, a kind of grounded strength that didn't come from money or power, but from choosing kindness even when life was rough. He realized he had been moving through the world as if compassion made a person soft. Yet here she stood, someone who had every reason to be bitter, offering warmth to a stranger because that was who she was. Something in that recognition humbled him. He found himself wanting to live up to the standard she set, without even knowing it, wanting to be better than the cold logic he used to justify decisions that hurt families like hers. He felt guilty, but he also felt grateful, because her presence showed him that change was possible, even for someone like him. And moments like this often become turning points long before anyone realizes it. When a person hears something simple that cuts deeper than expected, it tends to grow into decisions that reshuffle everything later on, even if the meaning isn't clear yet. What's happening now is setting up a choice that will return with much more force down the line. Grace brought him a refill and gently joked that he looked like someone trying to solve the whole world in his head. He let out a quiet breath that almost felt like a laugh, admitting it had been a long day. She didn't press for details. Instead, she reminded him that whatever choices he faced, he should make the one he could look back on without regret, because regret has a way of sticking around longer than fear. Those words settled into him, like a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. For the first time, he felt a bit of clarity breaking through the fog. He thanked her again, and the gratitude in his voice was real, not rehearsed. She nodded, unaware that she was helping a man who held her family's future in his hands. Just as he started to feel that small sense of direction, his phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message that made his stomach sink. The board was meeting without him. No explanation, no warning, just a notification that things were moving forward, whether he was ready or not. He stared at the message, feeling the conflict rise again, sharper this time. The warmth Grace had given him collided with the cold pressure waiting on the other side of that phone, and in that moment, he knew something was shifting toward a point he couldn't step around. Whatever the board was planning, it wouldn't wait for him to find the courage he had just begun to uncover. Elias stepped out of the diner, with Grace's words still settling inside him, mixing with the heavy message that the board was meeting without him. The air felt colder as he crossed the parking lot, like the world had tilted just slightly, and he knew he couldn't ignore what was happening. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove faster than he meant to, the road blurring past, while his mind replayed Tom's tired eyes and Grace's calm strength. The closer he got to the corporate building, the tighter his chest grew, like each mile stripped away another layer of the control he always believed he had. By the time he rushed into the lobby and took the elevator up, he felt the same fear he had seen in the workers earlier, a fear he never imagined would touch him. The elevator doors opened, and a quiet hallway stretched ahead, the kind that usually gave him confidence, but tonight it felt unfamiliar, like the walls knew something he didn't. He entered the meeting room without waiting to be announced. Victor turned toward him with a slow smile that didn't reach his eyes. The rest of the board sat around the long table, their faces stiff, their documents spread out like weapons laid neatly in place. Elias could feel the shift immediately. Victor spoke first, calling his hesitation a liability, accusing him of letting emotions cloud his judgment. The words landed with a sting he tried not to show. Victor went on about responsibility and strength, twisting those ideas into something sharp. As Elias listened, a wave of memories came back. The first time he realized money could speak louder than he ever could. The years spent convincing himself that distance kept him smart, not cold. But now he felt each memory hit differently, revealing how much he had lost in the effort to stay untouchable. He saw how Grace moved through her world with kindness, even while carrying burdens. He saw how Tom worked with pride, even while afraid of the future. They had something he didn't, something that made his voice shake slightly when he finally spoke. He tried explaining that the factory wasn't just a number, that there were lives tied to every bolt and every shift, but Victor scoffed, accusing him again of weakness. The others shifted in their seats, some uneasy, some agreeing with Victor's tone. Elias felt heat rise in his face, not anger, but something more tender, something close to shame. He realized he wasn't defending a factory anymore. He was defending the part of himself waking up after years of hiding behind charts and cold logic. He stood straighter, trying to steady his breath, and said the company needed to remember its people, or it would lose itself. Those words surprised even him. A silence fell over the room, and he could feel the board studying him in a way they hadn't before, weighing not just his arguments but his resolve. Victor leaned forward, voice low and sharp, reminding everyone that leadership demanded discipline, not heart, and that Elias was risking the entire company by stalling. He even hinted at calling for a vote to remove him if he stayed on this path. For a moment the room blurred, and Elias felt fear in a way he never had. Fear of losing not the company but the version of himself he was finally becoming. His hands tightened at his sides as he realized how fragile his hold on everything had become. The board began whispering among themselves, and Victor announced that they would proceed with a vote on the factory closure right then and there. Papers were shifted, screens lit up, and Elias stood alone at the head of the table watching the future rearrange itself without him. The votes began, one by one, each voice sounding distant and hollow in his ears. He couldn't read their faces anymore. He couldn't tell who leaned toward compassion and who leaned toward the cold numbers that had once guided him so easily. All he could do was stand there, feeling every second stretch longer than the last. When the final board member finished, Victor gathered the results without revealing them. He looked at Elias with a calm expression that felt almost cruel and said the outcome would be sent to him shortly, once everything was recorded. Elias felt the air leave his chest. The building seemed too quiet, too controlled, too far from the simple truth he had found in the diner. He stepped back from the table, unsure of what would come next, only knowing that whatever decision waited for him was big enough to change far more than the numbers on a spreadsheet. Elias stood alone in the hallway long after the boardroom door had closed, feeling the building's silence settle over him like heavy dust. His phone buzzed again, and this time the message was short, direct, and colder than any of Victor's speeches. They wanted him to sign a compliance order approving the factory shutdown. No more delays, no more debate. The message made it clear. Either he signed and fell back in line, or they would move forward without him. For the first time, the empire he had built felt like it was slipping through his fingers, not because someone was stealing it, but because he was changing in ways the old rules no longer understood. The thought of the factory going dark pulled at him with a weight sharper than fear, and the image of Grace pouring coffee with that tired but steady smile kept rising to the surface. He felt a tight ache in his chest, knowing that her husband's job and the lives of so many others hung from the same thin thread he was being ordered to cut. He walked into his office, feeling like the room no longer belonged to him. The shelves lined with awards and framed deals looked hollow in the dim light, reminders of a version of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to be anymore. He sank into his chair, staring at the compliance document glowing on his screen. His hands hovered above the desk as memories from the day rose and blended together. Tom sweeping dust with quiet determination, the older worker describing the factory's better years, the fear woven into the town's conversations, and Grace telling him that regret lasts longer than fear. Those memories felt like they were pushing against the edges of the office, tightening around him until he could barely breathe. If he signed, he knew exactly what would happen. The town would crumble, families would break, hope would shrink into something painful, and the voice inside him, the one Grace had stirred awake, whispered that this was one decision he could not bury under logic. He stood abruptly, needing air, needing movement, anything to break the pressure building in his chest. He paced the room with fast, uneven steps, his thoughts racing through every angle. If he refused the order, he risked everything he spent years building. His authority, his position, even the respect of the people who once thought he was unshakable. It wasn't just a business choice now. It was a choice between living as the man he used to be, or becoming the man he had just begun to see in himself. And somewhere deep down, he realized the empire had never meant anything if it couldn't stand alongside the people who held it up. With a trembling breath, he returned to the desk and pushed the document away from him, the screen's light fading as it dimmed. He wasn't signing. He sent the refusal to the board with a short message, barely more than a sentence, but it carried the weight of everything he had felt since stepping inside that diner. When he hit send, a wave of finality washed over him. He had crossed a line no one could uncross for him. He wasn't sure if he felt relief or fear or something tangled between the two. What he did know was that gratitude filled the space where doubt had been. Gratitude for Grace's courage, gratitude for Tom's honesty, gratitude for the chance to make a decision shaped by something real instead of cold calculation. He whispered a quiet thank you to the empty room, knowing the people who had changed him would never know how deeply their words mattered. And honestly, moments like this always split people. Some think he made the right choice, others think he risked too much. What about you? Would you have signed to protect everything you built, or would you have taken the chance he just took to protect a whole town? Leave your thoughts, and if stories like this move you, make sure to subscribe so you can follow the next part of Elias's journey, because it's only getting deeper from here. As he stood by the window watching the city lights blur into the night, he felt a strange mix of fear and peace. The world outside looked the same, but he wasn't. He had made a choice, not for the empire but for the people who kept it breathing, and though the consequences hadn't arrived yet, he felt stronger than he had in years. Something important had finally solidified inside him, a quiet truth he couldn't ignore anymore. But another truth waited too, one he knew was coming. The board would not stay silent. Their answer would shape everything that came next, and he could already feel the future tightening in the air, ready to break open. Elias stayed by the window long after sending his refusal, watching the city lights blur while his heartbeat slowly steadied. The board's silence that followed felt louder than any argument he had faced so far, and he could tell from the heaviness in the air that they were already planning their next move. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked out of his office with a calm he didn't feel yet, heading back toward the conference floor. Every step carried a mix of courage and fear, but something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't walking into a meeting to defend numbers. He was walking in to defend people. When he pushed open the boardroom doors, the room went quiet for a beat. Victor sat at the head of the table like he owned the air around him, tapping his pen with a slow rhythm that felt like a challenge. Several board members lifted their eyes from their screens with guarded expressions. Elias understood the tension rising as soon as he stepped inside. They were expecting the man he had always been, the one who stayed silent when strategy outweighed conscience, the one who didn't question the rules if the math lined up. Instead, they found someone who carried the weight of a whole town in his voice when he began to speak. He didn't yell. He didn't try to overpower anyone. He simply laid out what he had seen that day. The pride in the workers' faces, the quiet fear, the real lives tied to every machine they wanted to shut down. He described the years of loyalty those people had given the company and how the town's future hung directly from their decisions. Then, he shifted to the bigger picture, explaining how cutting the factory might save money now, but would damage the company's reputation, trust, and long-term stability. He showed them how investing in modernizing the plant instead of closing it could turn it into a symbol of the company's future, not its past. His words didn't come from strategy books. He spoke like someone who had finally stepped into the world he used to ignore. And that sincerity made a few faces soften, though Victor's expression only hardened. Victor rose from his chair and accused him of letting feelings cloud his judgment, calling his arguments sentimental and short-sighted. He insisted that the company couldn't afford compassion, claiming the only path forward was the cold one. Elias felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't back down. Instead, he exposed tactics Victor had been using, pointing out the patterns of pushing decisions through during moments of pressure and hiding important details behind urgent deadlines. He reminded the board that leadership wasn't about folding to fear, but seeing farther than the panic of the moment. As he spoke, something inside him steadied, and he realized he wasn't afraid of them the way he had been before. He'd found a voice he didn't know he still had. And honestly, this is one of those crossroads where anyone watching has to ask themselves, what would they have done in that room? Would you have stood up against people who could take everything from you? Or would you have stayed quiet to keep your place safe? It's the kind of moment that shows who someone really is, and it's worth pausing to think about. The board members exchanged looks, some unsettled, others quietly agreeing with pieces of what Elias said. The tension spread across the table like a slow ripple, and Victor's anger sharpened as he tried one last time to push the closure forward. But Elias interrupted him with a steady voice, saying he would not sign the order under any circumstance, that the factory deserved another path, and that the company needed to grow with its people, not abandon them. The words hung in the air, firm and final, and for a moment no one spoke. Then the board announced they were calling an official vote to determine the factory's fate, and possibly his leadership. Elias stood quietly as they prepared the ballots, feeling the weight of the moment like a storm building in his chest. He could lose everything he had built. He could walk out without a title, without power, without security. But for the first time, that fear didn't make him shrink. It sharpened into something close to hope. The hope that standing his ground might spark a change bigger than anything he had planned. The voting began, each voice adding to the growing pressure. Elias kept his eyes down, listening, trying to read the unspoken meaning behind each word. When the final vote was cast, they didn't announce the result yet. They simply told him it would be delivered to him shortly, once the official documentation was complete. He stepped out of the room, his heart pounding, but he didn't feel broken. He felt alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning, and the hope that had started as a small spark in a diner was now burning into something strong enough to push him forward into whatever came next. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office waiting for the verdict, like a man holding a door shut while a storm beat against it. When the message finally came, it wasn't an answer. It was an order to return to the boardroom first thing in the morning. No explanation, no tone to read, just a demand. The sun was barely rising when he walked into the building again, and he could already sense the shift in the air. Victor was waiting for him, surrounded by screens filled with charts, projections, and red downward arrows, meant to crush hope before anyone could breathe. The rest of the board sat with tight expressions, as if they were bracing for a fight that had already begun. Victor wasted no time. He spun the large screen toward Elias and started firing off numbers. He showed losses, comparison graphs, predicted declines, and cash flow warnings. He spoke fast, almost aggressively, pointing to every detail as proof that keeping the factory open was a mistake, so big it could sink the entire company. Elias stood there taking it in, the weight of each number hitting hard. But unlike before, he didn't shrink under the storm. He looked at the charts and saw the truth behind them. Every dip, every cost, every warning was tied to people who had given their lives to the company. Numbers didn't scare him anymore, not the way they used to. He spoke slowly at first, telling them what he had seen, what he had learned, how he had felt walking through that factory and hearing workers try to stay hopeful while fearing the worst. His voice gained strength as he talked about loyalty, about long-term investment, about rebuilding trust. Victor cut him off, slamming his hand on the table, calling him naive, saying compassion was a weakness that would cost everyone their future. But Elias didn't back down. He fired back with something that made the room go still. Closing the factory might save money today, but it would destroy the company's identity tomorrow. And a company with no identity, no loyalty, and no humanity collapses faster than any financial chart could ever predict. Victor opened his mouth to argue again, but before he could speak, one of the older board members, Margaret, someone who rarely raised her voice, leaned forward and said something that froze the room. She told them she grew up in a factory town just like the one they were about to destroy. She remembered the day the local plant shut down, how her father came home with empty eyes, how families moved away, how her school lost teachers, how the whole place felt like it deflated piece by piece. She said she still remembered the silence of that night, and it stayed with her even now. Then she looked at Elias and told him softly that for the first time in years she heard leadership that wasn't powered by fear. The moment she said it, the tension broke, but not in Victor's favor. These kinds of moments always pull something out of people watching, because almost everyone has seen someone stand up against something bigger than them, and when one person finally speaks the truth everyone else has been avoiding, there's a feeling that spreads through the room, like everyone is breathing the same air and remembering the same kind of hurt. It's strange how shared memories can change the weight of a decision, but they do, and anyone hearing her words could feel it. Victor's face tightened, and he snapped at Margaret, accusing her of being swayed by emotions instead of logic, but the board was no longer fully on his side. Elias noticed it, the shift in posture, the unsure glances. The power he once thought was carved in stone was moving like sand beneath Victor's feet. Elias stepped forward and spoke directly to everyone at the table, telling them that the company needed courage more than caution, that standing by the factory was the smarter move in the long run, and that people would stand behind a company that stood behind them. He explained how reinvesting in the plant could bring in new contracts, attract talent, and rebuild reputation. His voice wasn't shaking now. It was steady, almost calm, because the truth on his side no longer felt fragile. Victor tried one last attempt to shut him down. He claimed Elias was risking financial ruin for a handful of workers. But before he could continue, another board member spoke up, saying they had reviewed the numbers again after hearing Margaret's story and believed Elias's plan had potential. A few others murmured agreement, hesitant but real. Victor's expression cracked just for a second, enough to reveal the fear beneath his anger. Elias felt something shift inside him at that moment, a flicker of hope that didn't feel naive anymore, but earned. The room didn't erupt. There were no cheers, but the balance had changed. Elias could feel it. Even Victor could feel it. What came next wasn't certain, but the tide had turned. For the first time, Elias wasn't the one standing on shaky ground. The company wasn't saved yet, and the vote hadn't been called, but the pressure that had been crushing him had opened just enough to let a breath of fresh air through. As the meeting broke into murmurs and whispered side conversations, Elias stepped back and watched the board wrestle with everything they had just heard. He didn't know which way the final decision would fall, but he could sense momentum gathering behind him. Fragile, yes, but real. And that small shift was enough to tell him that the fight wasn't over. In fact, it was heading toward a moment where everything would finally break open. Elias stayed in the hallway after the meeting broke apart into scattered whispers, watching board members drift away with heavy steps, some thoughtful, some shaken, and one, Victor, moving like a man sharpening a blade. The tension he carried from the confrontation didn't fade. It only changed shape, turning into a quiet determination that pushed him forward. He knew the vote was coming soon. He could feel it in the way the building's air seemed to tighten, in the way every conversation stopped when he entered a room. This wasn't just business anymore. It was the turning point of everything he ever believed about leadership, responsibility, and the people whose lives rested on his decisions. And he knew the next step had to be bold enough to shift the entire direction of the fight. The next morning, he presented his plan. He stood before the board and laid out a detailed proposal for an investment and retraining program, not as a desperate plea but as a strategic path toward rebuilding the company's long-term strength. He explained how new contracts could be drawn, how modernizing the plant could open the door to future production lines, and how training workers in updated systems could make the factory a flagship location instead of a fading cost center. While he spoke, the room watched him closely, some skeptical, some curious, some too guarded to show anything at all. Victor crossed his arms with a smirk he didn't bother to hide, but Elias kept going. He pointed out how other towns had collapsed when employers gave up on them, and how rebuilding this one could become the company's strongest message of loyalty and vision. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then the board asked for time to deliberate. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a loss either. It was the closest thing to a straight path he had seen since this began. He stepped out of the room and felt the weight lift enough for him to breathe again. He knew the vote would decide everything, and waiting for it would be its own kind of battle. With hours to spare before they called him back, he got in his car and drove to the factory once more. Something in him needed to see it again, to ground himself in the truth he was fighting for. When he arrived, the workers were just starting their shift. The hum of machines rose slowly as lights flicked on one row at a time. People moved with steady rhythm, talking quietly with co-workers, tying aprons, adjusting gloves, preparing for another long day without knowing the storm gathering behind closed doors. He watched from a distance, unnoticed, taking in the atmosphere that had lingered in his mind since the first moment he stepped inside. A young worker helped an older one lift a heavy box. Someone brought extra coffee for the crew, laughing softly as she handed out cups. And Tom walked through the space with that same tired dignity, greeting people with a nod that carried both fear and stubborn hope. None of them knew how close their world was to breaking. And somehow that resilience, raw, unpolished, quiet, made Elias's resolve even stronger. There are moments when life feels like it's holding its breath, like all the choices made so far are lining up behind you, waiting to settle their score. This was one of those moments, the kind that doesn't show its meaning right away but promises to return with force when the time is right. Elias walked farther into the plant, studying the machines, the faces, the way people carried themselves through worry with such steadiness. He felt a strange mix of pride and fear swelling in his chest. Pride, because the workers deserved more than the uncertainty they lived with. Fear, because if the vote went against him, he would have to walk back into this place knowing he had failed them. The thought of facing Grace again under those circumstances twisted something inside him. Her kindness, her calm strength, her faith in the future. He didn't want to be the one who destroyed that. After a while, he stepped outside and found himself pacing beside the loading dock, staring at the stacks of pallets waiting to be moved. The factory wasn't just a building now, it felt alive, like a place full of stories he had been blind to. He remembered walking in the first time with nothing but numbers in his head. Now those numbers had faces, names, voices. He wiped a hand across his face, trying to steady himself for what was coming. Whatever happened in the next hours would define more than the company's direction. It would define who he would be when the dust settled. His phone buzzed. A simple message flashed on the screen. Return to headquarters. The vote is ready. His breath caught for a moment. The world around him seemed to grow quiet, even though machines still rattled in the distance. He stood there looking at the factory one last time before turning back toward the parking lot. The sky seemed heavier, the air thicker, as if the whole town were waiting for its fate to be spoken aloud. He drove back with a knot tightening in his stomach, each mile feeling longer than the last. When he reached the building, he walked through the lobby with slow, steady steps, aware that in just a few minutes, everything, every choice, every argument, every realization would collide in a single decision. The elevator doors closed around him, sealing him in a moment that felt suspended between hope and fear. By the time he reached the boardroom floor, he knew the next breath he took would be the last one before his world shifted again. And as his hand touched the door, ready to step inside, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever awaited him on the other side was bigger than business. It was the turning point of a lifetime. Elias stepped into the boardroom with a breath held so tightly that his chest ached. The room was painfully quiet, lit by the soft morning light pushing through the tall windows, washing over the long table where every decision of his life seemed to be laid bare. The board members were already seated, each with papers in front of them, each carrying an expression that gave nothing away. Victor stood near the window with his back turned, one hand gripping the edge of the frame as if holding himself together. When he turned toward Elias, his eyes carried that sharp, cold anger he had tried to mask in earlier meetings. But Elias no longer looked away. He walked to his seat, steady but tense, his hands trembling just enough that he slid them under the table to hide it. The chairperson cleared her throat and explained that the board had reviewed every point, every number, every argument. She said the vote would be final and binding. The words pressed against Elias's ribs like a weight. He felt the room tilt slightly as the air grew thin, each heartbeat louder than the last. He looked around and saw the faces of people who had shaped his career, people who once praised him for being decisive, unshaken, efficient. But today those same people looked at him as if he were a stranger. He swallowed hard, thinking of Grace and the quiet strength in her eyes, thinking of Tom sweeping the floor with tired hope, thinking of the town waiting without knowing what the future held. The vote began. One by one, board members raised their hands or spoke their decisions, the room filled with small echoes that seemed to bounce off the walls and land in Elias's chest. He watched carefully, trying to read their eyes as much as their words. Some voted to keep the factory open, others to close it. The count tilted back and forth, swinging between hope and fear. Victor's vote came near the end. He delivered it with a tone of finality, saying close like it was a victory already won. Elias felt something inside him drop, but he didn't break. Not this time. He held his breath as the final vote approached, aware that this last voice would decide not only the factory's fate, but the man he would become after this moment. The last board member was Margaret. She looked at Elias with a soft expression, not pity, but understanding, deep, real understanding. Her voice was steady as she said she voted to keep the factory open. The words hit the room like a crack of thunder, muffled by carpet. Victor's face drained of color. A hush fell so deep that even the air seemed to freeze. The chairperson tallied the votes, then read the result aloud. By a narrow margin, the factory would stay open. The company would invest, not abandon. Elias felt his breath release in a trembling rush, his shoulders dropping as if someone finally lifted a mountain off his back. His heartbeat softened, spreading warmth through his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. Ground he had chosen, not inherited. Victor erupted from his seat, slamming the table with his palm. He accused the board of weakness, of letting nostalgia poison their judgment, but no one backed him. No one echoed his anger. He stood alone, shaking with disbelief, then stormed out of the room without another word, the door swinging shut behind him like a final, bitter punctuation mark. The room stayed silent for a moment longer. Some members looked relieved, others exhausted, but all of them seemed changed by what they had just witnessed. Elias rose slowly, thanking those who had supported him. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile wide. He simply nodded with gratitude, aware that this moment wasn't about winning. It was about becoming the man he wished he had been all along. He stepped out into the hallway, where the morning light felt different now, warmer somehow, almost gentle. He pressed a hand against the wall, steadying himself as the enormity of what had just happened washed over him. His transformation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deep, and certain. He had chosen people over profit, compassion over fear, courage over convenience. The victory wasn't just over the system. It was over the part of himself that once believed protecting his empire mattered more than protecting the lives inside it. As he walked toward the elevator, the weight in his chest slowly lifted, replaced with a sense of purpose that felt new but strong. He wasn't done. The real work was ahead, facing the town, facing Grace, rebuilding trust, proving that this wasn't a moment of weakness, but the beginning of a new path. The elevator doors opened and he stepped inside, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. This was not the end. It was the breath before the final resolution, the quiet before everything changed again, and as the doors slid shut, he knew exactly where he needed to go next. Elias drove back to the diner with a quiet heartbeat that felt new, almost steady, almost peaceful. The sun had begun to dip behind the low buildings, casting a warm orange light across the parking lot. It looked almost the same as the first time he pulled in, yet everything inside him was different. When he stepped through the door, the familiar smell of coffee and frying onions wrapped around him like a memory returning home. Grace was behind the counter, refilling sugar jars, humming softly to herself. She looked up the moment she sensed him standing there and gave him the same gentle smile she gave every stranger, the smile that had unknowingly shaken the direction of an entire company. She still didn't know who he was. She didn't know how deeply her kindness had reached. But she noticed something in his eyes, something lighter than before. He sat in the same booth as that first morning, his hands resting calmly on the table. Grace walked over with a fresh cup of coffee without even asking if he wanted one. She placed it gently in front of him and said he looked like a man who had just finished a long climb and finally reached a steady place to stand. Her words hit something tender in him. He thanked her quietly, truly, not out of politeness but from a place of real gratitude. He didn't tell her about the boardroom or the vote or the storm he had walked through. He didn't say that her voice had echoed in his mind during the hardest moments. He didn't share how her calm strength became the compass he used to find his own. Instead, He simply said that sometimes a person changes because someone who didn't know them at all treated them like they mattered. Grace held his gaze for a moment, her eyes softening with a warmth that understood more than she admitted, and she nodded as if she felt the truth behind the words, even without hearing the story. Outside, the town was already shifting. A few workers from the factory passed by the windows, talking with more energy than usual. The tension that had wrapped itself around the town for months was loosening, slowly but clearly. The retraining program had been announced that morning, and word was spreading fast. People were calling their families, telling them they wouldn't have to move, that their jobs were safe, that new opportunities were coming. Kids ran past the diner windows with backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, laughing like they had no